All right, friends, we'll give just a few more moments for people to join and then we'll get started. All right, friends, I'm going to let you know that you can use the chat box now that is open. Please feel free to add commentary during our conversation. And then also, I'm going to ask Reverend Dr. Jose some questions, but I also want you to know that you can add some questions to our QA box or to the chat during our conversation, and we'll answer those at the end of this conversation today. And with that, Reverend Dr. Jose Martinez, why don't you kick us off, please?
Well, hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us. Looking at everybody's where they're from, that's so awesome. Want to give a shout out to Creech Air Force Base. Was out there back in 2009. Did a tour out in Nellis, and then went up the road a little bit. Did a little tour of Creech, and it was a really cool experience. Loved it. And I'm so glad that we could come here and talk about this Disciples Next. If you don't know who I am Reverend Dr. Jose Martinez. I am the Minister of New Church Strategies. Been in this position for almost a year now as the settled pastor, but I was part of the new church movement before that. Started in 2019. As you all know, I've said this out throughout this whole time that, I'm not a cradle disciple, but I've been in the restoration movement for long enough. So was part of the independent Christian churches before I came into the Disciples of Christ. And so it's been wonderful to be able to do this and to take my experience from what I've learned from the evangelical side of things when it comes to church planting and looking at how we do things within the disciples, in particular when it came to the 2020 vision and how we're moving forward since the pandemic. And so glad you tuned into this. This is the conversation that we're going to have. So if you have questions about Disciples Next, please lay them out for us so that we can really answer. We want you to have a pretty good understanding of what we're trying to do in this whole thing. So, and again, it's a conversation. I want to welcome my conversational partner, the Reverend Wesley King. So Wesley, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yes, hello everybody. I'm so glad I'm here. I have had food poisoning for the last 36 hours, and so I'm so glad that I'm feeling up to having this very important conversation. I am Reverend Wesley King. I am newly ordained, just got ordained back in August. My good friend and colleague and boss, Reverend Dr. Jose, was there to help make that happen. I've been working for the New Church Ministry as a program coordinator for almost 3 years now. So I am kind of integral in the infrastructure part of the ministry. And one of the things that I get to do is plan these webinars so that we can share what we're learning at the general church level with everyone in our tradition and those beyond. So today, I thought we might structure this conversation by collectively assembling some of the frequently asked questions that we get when someone says, "What is Disciples Next?" This is a really, really new concept that has just been rolled out this summer at General Assembly. We've had a couple of conversations there and since then, but still it is a very relatively new concept. And so we're hoping to address a lot of those frequently asked questions during this webinar. So I'm going to kick it off with the first obvious question, Reverend Dr. Jose. What is Disciples Next? Can you please give us an overview of what Disciples Next is?
Okay, so I hope everybody hears this. Disciples Next is a framework, and it's a framework that's centered around our identity as a denomination, being a movement for wholeness in a fragmented world. And that is the framework is comprised of our mission statement of the disciples of Christ: to be the good news, to share the good news, to love and serve from our doorsteps to the ends of the earth. So we just broke down our mission statement and put it in these three components. So many of you probably seen this Venn diagram looking thing that has these three components in there. And again, it's all centered around our identity statement of being a movement for wholeness in a fragmented world. And again, with the Disciples Next framework, we are transitioning our language from church planting language to movement making language for that simple reason. So it is to help us figure out ways, a framework to figure out a way how to start these new congregations that really, truly model of who we are as a denomination, as a movement for wholeness. So also with that, there is a understanding of our history coming from the Restoration Movement, not only being a movement for wholeness, but from the Restoration Movement, and also known as the Stone Campbell Movement. So that's overall what Disciples Next thing is. It's a framework centered around our identity statement that's comprised of our mission statement, and that makes the framework.
So I think one of the things that has been helpful for people to kind of understand more about what this new concept is, when we say framework, there are several things that are included in that word. It is a curriculum. This year at Leadership Academy, this curriculum developed by Reverend Dr. Jose Martinez was introduced and implemented as the new curriculum for Leadership Academy, which, if you don't know, is our training program that happens every fall, that we train new leaders and new church starters in this new program. And for this year, it was the first year that we actually implemented this curriculum. It's also kind of like a strategic plan in a sense, in that everything that we do moving forward will be through this lens of what Disciples Next is. So it's informing the ministries that we are creating, the conversations that we're having, and who those people might be. And then also, of course, what we're teaching the folks that come through Leadership Academy and some of our other programming needs. I wanted to mention that I included a link to our website and to the link, the tab for Disciples Next, so that you can look at that at your own time and read more about that. And the Venn diagram that he was mentioning is listed there. But my next question for you, Jose, is how did you develop this? Because being kind of behind the scenes, I get to see, I mean, this is a really dense is not a good word for it, because dense feels like stuffy, but it's a very thorough, I guess is a better word, thorough curriculum. We will only scratch the surface here today, but each section was well over 10 pages long, and it's a very thorough framework. How did you develop this framework, and what steps did you take in putting this together?
Right. So it's all basis of the 2020 vision. So a lot of people, if you don't know, in the early 2000s, we as a denomination, our general minister at the time Reverend Dr. Decam, came out with this plan called the 2020 Vision, and we adopted it as a church, as a whole denomination. And what in that 2020 Vision was 4 priorities. It laid out 4 priorities of the church. If you don't know what those 4 priorities, you can look it up into disciples.org. But here were the 4 priorities: to becoming a pro-reconciling, anti-racist church, the formation of 1,000 new congregations by 2020, transformation of 1,000 current congregations by 2020, and leadership development necessary to realize these new and renewed congregations. And so out of that new church ministry, we had a portion of the development of the leadership, and also we were focused on 1,000 new congregations by 2020. We reached that. So this whole idea was, okay, well, what's the next thing? What is the next thing for that? And we always want to keep that to becoming an anti-racist, pro-reconciling church as one of our top priorities. What we decided to do for the next thing is, as the pandemic really transformed on how we approached ministry and how we became church, because we were all on lockdown, we had to go into this new normal sort of thing. And now we're in a time in a frame where it is being what's coming after the pandemic. And I'm not saying we're post-pandemic. Again, we're utilizing new language. We're pandemic informed. So what is the next thing? What is this next normal during this pandemic informed age? And so the idea of the Disciples Next comes from that, in that we are developing methodologies to help us continue what we were trying to set out for in those 4 priorities as a denomination, as a church. So when looking at that, because what we learned in the pandemic, the heart of the pandemic, and as we're learning in the pandemic informed age, we need to create new methodologies to engage with community. So we developed new tools to help us kind of like really connect with our neighbors, to connect with people who are around us. We developed this idea of pandemic informed ministry, along with adopting trauma informed ministry and putting out the principles in that, and like putting it in these categories, all the while still trying to focus on the different metrics, or not metrics, markers that we want to express as a community of faith. So and the reason why we're calling it framework is because we can it's open, so it's adaptable to whatever community that you're in. So that's one of the key things. And it's like I developed like a process. I didn't really develop the whole, because the reason why it's thorough is because I'm building upon what our past leaders have done. Yeah. And we're just kind of bringing it all together, and not necessarily trying to adopt things from outside of our denomination like we were trying to do, which wasn't wrong. It was just, it wasn't us. And now this is more us, because we're using the information that we have. And what we're trying to do at New Church Ministry is just to kind of bring it all together into a comprehensive program that we can help train our leaders in.
Yeah, so something you mentioned that I want to highlight that I think is important for people to understand is, yes, we are looking forward. We're thinking about what the next thing is for us. And yet, this feels very rooted in our identity and in who we are. I mean, it feels like we're getting back to our roots as a movement people, a people born out of revival, born out of movement. You mentioned Stone Campbell movement, the Restoration movement. Our tagline being a movement for wholeness in a fragmented world. So while this is kind of like what's next, what's new, what's futuristic for our tradition, it's still very much tied and kind of grounded in who we are. The purpose of Disciples Next, I think, is people would assume it's just for New Church. But I think that you would agree that it's yes, it is, but it's bigger than that. Can you say more about the purpose of Disciples Next and how this framework, yes, is for a new church, and it's how we're going to be implementing what we do in programming and in curriculum and all those things. But it's so much bigger than that. If you could expand on that, please.
Yeah, it's we're trying to provide a language for everybody within our churches, within our congregations, at a regional level, at a local level, and at the general level. Because this idea of next, again, it's about the next normal. Because we're always going to be dealing with the pandemic issues, people dealing with long COVID, people still dealing with grief issues that they haven't that was caused by COVID, that they're still dealing with it. The emotional and spiritual distress that's caused by that kind of thing. And, I was just at my military training this past weekend, and there were people there that tested positive for COVID. And so we're in today. So it's like this next thing that we have to continue to adapt and change to. So providing language for all of our churches, because of that pandemic, it caused all of us to be new church. We all had to start freshly and figuring out new ways, different ways to be church to our community. And so that's what the purpose is it for everyone, not specific brand new congregations in formation. This is also for the chartered members. But of course, we as New Church Ministry, as a general unit, we're focusing on developing those congregations in formation and helping regions to do that. So
yeah, so I mean, it is a much broader lens of how we're looking at church. I also just want to mention that you mentioned the military service. In case you didn't know, Reverend Dr. Jose Martinez retired from the military this weekend after 26 years of service. So thank you for that. I've been sick and I have not been able to tell you congratulations, but congratulations, friend.
well, thank you so much on that.
Yeah, for me, this feels like something that we'll use, but we hope that grows and that other ministries, general ministries, local congregations will use, because as you mentioned, post lockdown, I'll say, not post pandemic, obviously, as you mentioned, pandemic informed, but post lockdown, we are all doing church in a new way. I don't know any churches that went completely back to normal, right? So we are all new church in this moment, and so this is hopefully a really great tool, framework, lens, whatever words you want to use for it, for people to look into to how this might benefit them and their ministry and where God is calling them in the world. I do want to ask though, because one time on a trip representing New Church Ministry, I had someone at a regional gathering ask me, why are we starting new churches when some of our churches are dying?
Yeah.
And I had to have a hard conversation with her and say, well, I think that the purpose of the church is to follow what God is doing in the world, rather than keep everyone comfortable and content with what they've always had. And so these new churches are providing people and ministry to the world that some of these other churches have not. And it's not a battle or a fight, but that they can coexist. So how do you see Disciples Next being the future of the church, especially to those folks who might be cynical or might have some reserved feelings because they see their own churches, their own contexts shrinking or changing?
Right. So there are a couple of things there. First thing, I'll pull out a Barna study. They did a study. The best way to gain new members into something is to start something new. People are just really excited about all that sort of thing. But that doesn't mean that the chartered congregations do not have a purpose in this. Like I said, we all have to develop new ways to approach our community. The purpose of new congregations, I would say from our perspective, would be there are just a lot of people out there who have been hurt by traditional church. And so always engaging with the community, listening to the community, and having the community say what it is that they need for their spiritual wellness and for their spiritual care. There's always going to be something different that comes about. Well, whether that's a different ministry that a chartered congregation provides, or is it a brand new congregation, that is up for the discussion. But we're here to be prepared to answer the call of whatever the community decides for, and like I said, we can't do our work without the chartered members. So we were all once a new congregation, a congregation information, every single one of us, whether you're a 100-year-old congregation or a 2-year-old congregation, we all had that incipient start. And so just like reminding our chartered members about that there was this first start down here, and we're not trying to build bigger congregations. Sometimes the community just wants lots of little different congregations around, so it just, again, it depends on the community, and we can't, one size doesn't fit all sort of thing. And so there's a reason why Paul says, to the slave I became a slave, to the poor I became poor, to the that sort of thing, in the scriptures. We're just trying to do the same thing, just to listen to the community of how we need to react and the better way to serve them. So
Yeah, one of the things that I've heard recently, kind of comparing the ways that we've started churches in the past and how we're doing it now, is in one model, we would show up and say, this is what I have to give. And in the other model, we show up and ask, what do you need? And that's where I kind of see Disciples Next kind of living into this, what do you need? You mentioned a little bit about this, about Disciples Next being a decolonized framework too, because that has kind of informed the ways that we have started churches in the past. Can you say a little bit more about what this new framework, or how it differs from that old style, and also obviously why decolonizing church starts is important?
right. So when we think about church planting, which is like the models that we were utilizing to really start these new churches and get them going. The language is kind of foreign to us as a denomination, because we are one church. As disciples, we're one church, and we're expressed by congregations. On a regional level and the local level. So that's one reason, just to kind of get out of that. We're not planting churches. We're starting new congregations, we're starting movements, basically. And so additionally, when it comes to the church planting language overall, yes, it's biblical when we talk about the fields and preparing planting seeds and things of that nature. And also, it's been utilized within the United States in a particular context when we think about the plantation period of our nation, our colonial period of our nation, where that language was brought into the church planting world. When you think about the history of the church in the United States of America, when the city was started, there was often a mission there, alongside the city hall. That's how they started it. When the colonists came onto this land, they would raise the land, they would plow the field, they would plant their seeds, and then that's how they would claim ownership of the land. And so when you look at some of these church planting models, it kind of reflects that. So we want to go away from that and really develop ways that we can start new congregations that are more organic, that involve more of the indigenous population. And when I say indigenous, people that are in those neighborhoods, not like forcing a population upon a neighborhood, right? So we want to work with the people, not work over the people. Right? So that's the whole reason of the other aspect of this language shifting.
And this also speaks to the 4 principles of being an anti-racist church. while I'm talking about that, I know Stephen in the chat had said, what do we mean when we say church or the church? Typically, when I'm saying church or the church, I'm meaning Big C church, the denomination, or the church universal. What do you think about that,
Yeah,
Jose? Do
I
you?
would say the same thing,
Yeah,
in particular when it comes to us. When I say the church, that's who we are as the disciples. We call ourselves the church, and we're expressed by congregations. Again, not just planting more churches, we're starting new congregations within our church. And so it's going back to the whole Christian unity kind of talk that we have in our denomination. So uh,
yeah.
another conversation.
Yeah, yeah. And I also want to say a good hello to Reverend Kyle down in Georgia, but he mentions and affirms too that it is more difficult for new people to join existing churches. New attracts new.
Mhm.
There are just certain things that new congregations can do that existing churches cannot. And I think the goal for what I was hoping to have this conversation with that woman is that to see that they are not in competition, but they're in collaboration and ministry together. um, you mentioned the language change, and I want to just speak to that because I know sometimes, even myself, we can get really grumpy when it comes to change, and changing language is part of that. But language really does matter. Can you speak a little bit more about why the language change help is both a part of Disciples Next, but also is a part of that trauma informed care? Can you just say a little bit more about that too?
Yeah, so we know in the United States, a lot of people have gone through a lot of religious trauma, spiritual abuse, and moral injury. And this is the conversation that we have within the Disciples Next curriculum, in particular to Be the Good News, where we're connecting it to the contemplative action piece as an approach and bringing in trauma informed ministry and that trauma informed language to that conversation. Um, and moving away from more traditional terms like evangelism. Um, Evangelism is important. Talking about the word of God is very important. But utilizing another term such as prophetic advocacy helps us in a way to um, speak to people, because they would be like, well, what does that mean? Sort of thing. And really changing the way that we approach how we utilize the word of God into action for the common good within our community. So, and again, the language shift also helps us in, like, again, when we're talking about, instead of talking about church planting, we're talking about starting movements. That helps us shift this paradigm to create new mental models. So in the church planting world that I was part of so many years ago and had deep conversations, is that we had this conversation of, we need to change the paradigm. We need to change the paradigm. But we keep coming up with the same models because the paradigm couldn't shift, because we were utilizing the same language. You can't shift anything if you're using the same terms, the same language to try to come up with something new. So yeah, so that's one of the other key thing of like switching the language.
Yeah, yeah. So we have a question come in from Doug that I just saw. What are specific examples of this new way working?
Yeah.
I believe I have some sense of the concepts and the desire to do something new while staying true to our DOC roots, but I'm struggling with what this actually looks like in specifics. Can you please help with some examples? Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is really interesting. Um, let's see, let's how to approach this. So um, it's not technically, again, not technically a new way. I believe that the first century Christian church was a movement, right, in itself, and that we're trying to get back to this kind of idea, Christocentric movement, but this idea, like one example, like people have criticized like these running churches or yoga churches or things of that nature, and there was a time where uh we were really against, I heard a lot of conversation against e-church. And I heard the term that e-church is not church. And guess what? The pandemic changed that.
Yeah.
And so that to me is like one example of one way of like God turning everything upside his head and say, hey, look, It is church, because we learned how to overall fulfill that mission of to be the good news, to share the good news, and to serve from our doorsteps to the ends of the earth in that way. So again, this framework is about how does your community do that? And again, with the contemplative action, prophetic advocacy, and the faith-rooted organizing pieces of it, that is the methodology that we suggest, because the way that we have gotten to this point is because we were studying the movements that were happening since the mid 2000s. So, looking at the Occupy movement, looking at the Black Lives Matter movement, looking at the Poor People's Campaign, utilizing those movements and saying, hey, God is in that. And people were joining those movements because not necessarily because that's what they were passionate about. Yes, that has to do with it, but the Spirit was moving them in those movements. And there was a lot of theological talk. Jörg Rieger is a theologian that I follow a lot, and he has a book out there about the Occupy movement, and there's a lot of a theological breakdown of what was going on. And so, those are kind of a couple of the answers. There is no specific answer right now, because we're all in an experimental phase of this, right? As we're approaching in this new normal, or this next normal, we're creating new ways of being church, whether it's just online, whether we have a community on a gaming system like Roblox or Minecraft, to having a virtual reality church like on Second Life, or Alt Life is the name of the game, and you put on your VR goggles and you can go to worship on that, to this hybrid sort of connection. Whether you're doing service live and then you got people there, and then you have people online that you're trying to engage with. So those are some of the nascent examples, but it could be open, because again, this framework is all about taking in whatever it can fulfill these different areas that we've decided as a denomination that we find important: to be the good news, to share the good news, and to serve from our doorsteps. Anything can fit in that model, I think, or in that framework.
So this is actually a really great segue. So what excited me about Disciples Next is that, the churches that we were seeing start were looking more like storytelling church, or a trauma-informed church. They were looking more like the skateboard church that you mentioned. I mean, they were not looking like traditional churches. And this is kind of a follow-up that Stephen asked in the Q&A. It's what does a new church or new congregation look like? Do you mean brick and mortar? And I would say the answer to that is no. The new faith communities that we have seen are looking so vastly different than the churches that have been started in the past. Stephen even asked, how would a 3-acre farm work as a church? And yet I know of some ministries, specifically one from Twitter right now, Jubilee down in Alabama, where they are growing produce and using some of that produce to help feed the hungry in their community. And they are now looking at how do we start building community. We've done what we've been tasked to do by Christ, feeding the hungry. Now, how do we create community around that? And so they're building upon that.
Right.
Gene just said, yes. So still in the framework of 1,000 different ways. Absolutely.
Yeah. And that's the key thing that I would want to also highlight as a new priority for us, is not necessarily for us to start 1,000 new congregations, but for us to train the amount of leaders, whether it's 1,000 leaders or whatever, to start these new congregations in whatever way, infinite amount of ways, 1,000 different ways, so yeah, that's what we're focusing on, not like the counting part. We want to measure the influence that we can help with our new leaders to bring out their influence into their community for positive transformational change for the common good.
Yeah. So Stephen also asked, would the community that breathes and moves on that farm in the suggestion or the hypothetical be considered congregants, congregation, church, or are we still making a distinction between social service of the church and real church? And that's a valid question because we just said that language matters. But we are actually starting to introduce language like movement. So if you're a church starter, we are starting to call those folks movement initiators. I think the language is up to, you know, in our disciples polity, the language used is, I guess, best what fits the congregation or the group needed. And we'll have to work through how we identify that from like a logistical standpoint. But our main focus right now is just to expand the mind of what church could be.
Exactly. And I would also say, Chaplain John von Altman on there is saying each location will have its own needs, and that's exactly right. We want to empower the leaders to have these tools and to empower them to have the conversations with their community so that the community itself can say what they need, because again, the image of God is in all of us. It's about having us to recognize it all together, and the Spirit moves in that. And so they're gonna be connected, and so they're gonna be able to say what it is that they want to be called, whether we want to be called a congregation or just a movement, or we're just a community of faith, or we are a community of care. To me, community of care is what I would prefer to call everybody. Like, we're creating new communities of care with people that really care for, that love their neighborhood or their neighbors. And when I say neighbors, I mean overall. There, you might be in a rural area where you're spread across, or you can be in an urban area. I'm using the idea of neighbor just as Jesus did, and as Mr. Rogers did.
Yeah. There's a great question, excuse me, in the chat. Darlene says, how is this new movement rooted in an ecumenical and interfaith spirit? I love the idea of decolonizing. Part of that has to be perceived superiority of Christianity and a certain type of it, Christian nationalism. Also, I'm in Canada, and we definitely need to embody our own sense of what is needed here for how God is doing new things. So I know we've been speaking about kind of bringing it back to the disciples, to our roots, and to our identity. But I still think that this completely fits into an ecumenical and interfaith collaboration. Can you address that for me, please?
Yeah. So I always use the example of my chaplaincy work in the military. On my uniform, there's a cross that shows that I am a Christian chaplain, but my job is not there to proselytize the people within the military. My job there is to care for the people, providing that pastoral care, and to allow them to know that, even though they might not have the same belief system as me, that there are people that still care for them. And to me, as the church, that's what we're here to do in the world, that we are to be the physical representation of the holy, a reminder of the holy. And we believe in Jesus Christ as the Christian church. And so it's okay for us to do that, and that to let everybody know that we're a community of care, not for our sake, for everyone's sake.
Yeah.
And we're informed by our faith, and it's okay. And it's okay that you to be different in faith, and that we can work together for the common good for all in our community. So I think it lends well to that.
Yeah. There was a statement in the chat that I wanted to address really quickly. It's cut off, so I can't see who said it, but I don't think that the language of church automatically excludes movement. Indeed, church ought to be moving, dynamic, changing, etc. Church also ought to be decolonizing, anti-racist, etc. So we need not necessarily throw out church, but fill out what church is to be. Yes, absolutely. We have no plans to not use the word church anymore. I don't even know how we would do that.
Right.
But we are just kind of focusing more on some new language that includes church. but that is maybe a new way forward.
Yeah, the thing that I would hope that the whoever said that would hear is that we are the church.
Right.
We are the church. We're not planting new churches because we are the church. We're starting new congregations. We're starting new communities of care. We're starting new communities of faith. That's what we're focusing on because we are the church. You know, when you disciple people, the church grows,
Yeah.
right? The church will be realized because we're discipling people, you know, and just like when people hear the word church, they think of this building,
Right.
and we're more than just building, you know,
Yeah.
an edifice. We are the people. We are the body of Christ. So that's what I'm really trying to help us kind of like image in our mind, and you know, because I think we've really gotten away from that holistically, not
Yeah.
just us as a denomination, but the big C church, everybody, every denomination, because we've commercialized it.
You know, that brings up a good point. One I think in my perception of this framework, one of the focuses is to kind of decenter this idea that a new church has to be started, grow, and then built into a brick and mortar building. And it has to be, you know, it has to explode and be huge for it to be successful. And I think what I see this framework doing is decentering that notion, which is also built in decolonizing work and this kind of evangelical framework of church planting. And I think about one of the churches that I did my internship with when I was finishing my MDiv. That church is probably 10, 12 people. And yet I have had some of the most holy moments in my life at that congregation. And I've seen some of the most beautiful work being done at this little church that has 10 to 12 people in person. They do have a lot of people come online too, but it's still what everybody would call a small, tiny church. And yet the things that they are able to accomplish for the work of the kingdom is more than I've seen some of our big established churches do.
Right.
It's just outstanding. So that's another thing that kind of what you're kind of alluding to is that we're shifting this mindset of what makes a church and what makes a church successful.
Yeah, and you know, micro communities are just as effective as larger communities, and we see that. We see. I might lose the internet because I just lost power. So, so we see that in Scripture that there are micro congregations in Scripture, and then we see people by the thousands being converted to Christianity. You know, that sort of thing. So we have both and. You know, it's not like we're getting rid of anything. It's a both and sort of kind of thing.
Yeah. Uh-oh. I think we might have lost him. Okay. Well. All right. Well, we will see if he comes back, and if so, we will continue that. But I thought in the meantime, some questions were asked, and I might be able to help answer some of these. So Nadine Compton asked in the Q&A box, how can regions get involved in this framework? Because again, we mentioned earlier that this is created for New Church, but I imagine that it's going to go much bigger than that. I would say for me, I would say that I would love to see regional staff, regional ministers, regional New Church staff, regional boards come and include themselves in our programming. We do a leadership academy every year. You can next year we'll likely have an online version and an in-person version. We also do these impact episodes quarterly. We'll have a leaders retreat, and all of this programming will include this curriculum for Disciples Next. I think we're getting Jose back here. Let's see if we can. Here we go.
Sorry about that. I have to join from my phone now.
That's all right. That's quite all right.
Yeah.
Well, we've only got a few moments left, so I want to just address a few more questions and comments that were in the chat box and that were in the Q&A box. One of the ones that I just kind of mentioned was, how can regions get involved in this framework? And I mentioned that having regional ministers, regional staff, regional new church folks attend our trainings, attend our impact episodes, our retreats, all of those things is one way to kind of get immersed into this curriculum. What would you have anything to add to that? How regions can support the work that New Church is doing?
Yeah. So again, we have the NCLC, which is the New Church Cooperative, that we bring in all the folks from all the regions to come together and at a regional level to have these conversations, to kind of like discuss what's coming up new. And yeah, you're already all involved. You know, it's like adopting this language, because this is like for the whole church. Again, it's like we're not just focusing on congregations and formation. We're focusing on the regions and everything else like that. It's just hopefully what we can adopt this language into our whole life as a church, one big C church, and that we can just continue to move that forward. And as we do that, people will see the difference between us as a community versus other communities that might have not been so healthy for folks, you know. So
yeah. Elizabeth said, can't brick and mortar utilize this new language and framework for revitalization? Absolutely. Yeah. This is something that I hope that all churches will use. And again, we're treating all churches like new churches post lockdown, at least. We're not out of the pandemic yet, but post lockdown, all churches have been treated like new churches. And so I'm hoping that all churches will be able to use this and utilize this. I did include the link in the chat box. You can also go to our website and look at Disciples Next under the About section. And I'll also include it in our follow-up email with the recording of this this webinar. And I invite you all to begin reading about it. This is just one of the initial conversations about it. We won't be able to dive into it or get too deep into it in this one conversation, but we are actually going to expand upon it in great depth next year, and we're excited about that.
Yeah, the other thing I would say about brick and mortar congregations, I was just in Selma, California, FCC Selma, a historical congregation in that community, and I'm there. Why am I there? Not only to build support for new church ministry, but also to say they are new church, and that there's something to be said about sanctuary, the idea of sanctuary. And the brick and mortar congregations are at a prime position. You know, when we start looking at our buildings as assets versus as liabilities, and we can really utilize our buildings in a way that provides a sanctuary for people. Of course, again, we have to develop these new approaches, this different language for those who have been hurt, been traumatized by brick and mortar churches. Yeah. Maybe not us, but others, because they all associate the same thing. And we allow that space to be open and safe, in a safe place to question and to have dialogue and things of that nature. That is a key component in this whole thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. Carolyn mentioned in the chat that it might be excellent if there is a forum, possibly twice a year, to share structures and new formations to those that might be interested in new ideas and structures. That's a great idea. One thing I know that we're going to do is next year we're going to be diving into the different core competencies of what Disciples Next is, which is faith rooted organizing, contemplative action, and prophetic advocacy. And so we'll be doing some more deep diving on those three. And with all of those, we will have some forums and some Q&A time to kind of dive into what that actually means and how that could look in your context. And I think what you're asking too, Carolyn, is what are the new churches out there? And I did want to say that one of the things that Reverend Dr. Jose has been doing is kind of highlighting some of these new churches and what they look like and how they are ministering to their communities. And so we're going to be doing even more of that in the new year as well.
Before I got cut off, I think there was another question that popped up about something along finances.
Yes. One of the questions is how to support the pastors financially with small communities of faith, especially new ones.
Yeah, that is a deep, hard question. Because when we look at the studies that come from like, PRI or the Barna, and we were talking about the rate of attrition of congregations closing, the financial support is just going to be harder to get to because of all the closing of different churches. I mean, even churches like the Episcopal Church or the United Methodist Church, where they have like this centralized sort of like they pay the pastor versus the church itself. The church kind of pays into a system, and then the pastors are paid from the denomination sort of thing. That's even getting harder for them, that sort of thing. So in a system like ours, where it's like all on the congregation because, we're autonomous like that, we have to figure out creative ways of getting funding too. So within the evangelical movement, they've been having this kind of conversation about bivocation and co-vocation. I was telling people I was working my Air National Guard chaplaincy. I was working at a Trauma One Center, all the while starting 2 different congregations at the same time, and then doing the pulpit supply preaching in the in-between. So I was kind of like spread apart to make some sort of cash flow. And even then I had a spouse that was able to support me. And the way that our current system is doesn't really lend itself to that. If there's a pastor who's single or unpartnered, that don't have that second income, it's harder for them to sustain a living wage for themselves to survive and that sort of thing. And that bivocational thing might spread them too thin. And, depending on the needs of the community, it might just not be plausible. So finding different avenues, entrepreneurial avenues for congregations to make some sort of income to help supplement or augment the cost of pastors' expenses, whether that's maybe investing in a building that has a living quarters to it. I know this is going back to parsonage days, but I mean, like, maybe that might be an opportunity. Developing some sort of for-profit, like t-shirt making company or some sort of business venture that helps make money, and they use that money to pay their staff, that sort of thing. So like really thinking of these different ways of us structurally in governance to help us to do that, so, but overall, I think bivocation, co-vocation sort of lifestyle is the way ahead in a lot of these new congregations.
Yes. And Darlene also said it'd be great to see more funding possibly at the global level for our churches. I'm going to go ahead and highlight that every year we take up the Pentecost offering, and all of that money goes to either the regional new church team or the general new church team, like me and Jose. And it's wonderful, and giving has been up comparatively, but there are still so many churches who don't participate in the Pentecost offering. And so one thing that could be helpful is if everyone here make sure that your church participates in this very important offering, and then tell your clergy colleagues, especially the disciples, obviously, that this is important and that this goes to fund some of the opportunities that we give for these new church starts. We are about out of time. Let's see if we got a few more here. Let's see here. Alan, good to see you, Alan. Alan says, I have worked with congregations who have to move from full-time to part-time ministry to let go of the need requirements to own all of the pastor's time. For example, what would it mean to allow a pastor who is also an artist to have full use of one/several of those empty Sunday school classrooms for a studio free of charge? Yeah, Jose, would you like to jump in about Independence Boulevard in Kansas City and about the, I mean, we don't have too much time, but that's a great example of how that's building and that church is being utilized, I'd say.
Oh, yeah. So Leadership Academy was held at Kansas City, Missouri, at Community Christian Church. So I was trying to develop some sort of laboratory experience for folks that came in to experience congregations, local congregations, whether they're established like Community Christian or have a new church mentality, like I would say Independence Boulevard has. And the reason why we were highlighting Independence Boulevard, because they have a structure where it's the old structure of like, pay the pastor, pay for these bills, and we're losing money and that sort of thing. And the Reverend Mindy Fergarino, who's the lead pastor there, she has been very innovative and deep creativity in her brain to figure out ways of how to utilize the space in a different way that provides some sort of income to offset those expenses that often puts a lot of pressure on churches to dissolve or to hire part-time or even quarter time, that sort of thing. So there's like a school in there that pays a portion of the expenses. There's, of course, the Micah ministry that they've had in there. They have a nonprofit that is a clinic that is in there that helps offset some of those costs and things of that nature. And, so all that builds up over time. Now, will that make you be a pastor that has like a $60,000, even though that's low, $60,000 living wage? I don't know. It could, but it could offset to help build that up, that sort of thing. So there was something else to say about that too, but anyway, go ahead.
Darlene said 60,000 would be huge for Canada, or would be high for Canada. Yeah, I think as we close, what has the response been that you've heard thus far from folks when they hear about this new framework? And then what would you hope people would know about this framework when they leave today?
Yeah, so there's a lot of positivity that comes from a lot of people that have been in the deconstruction realm of things, of deconstructing their faith, deconstructing of way that we do things as church and everything else like that. And yet there's also part of our population that is still very rooted in the traditionalism that I would call traditionalism of the past, that it is valid, so this framework is open in the sense of like, to be the good news, to share the good news, and to serve from our doorsteps to the ends of the earth. You don't have to really follow what we suggested, what the, contemplative action, the prophetic advocacy, and the faith-rooted organizing. I utilize the examples of what the microchurch movement does. And they have three, what I call ecclesial minimums, worship, and they call it ecclesial minimums. They want worship, mission, and community. And if the new congregation fits in that pocket, then that's what they're doing. That's the minimum of what a church is for them. For us, it's to be the good news, to share the good news, and to serve from our doorsteps to the ends of the earth. And how that looks and what that looks like, again, depends on the community that you serve in. So if I have a lot of people coming back at me, well, what about evangelism? What about evangelism? I'm saying prophetic advocacy for me is the new evangelism, but a lot of people don't want to hear that, and that's okay. If there's a way for them to do evangelism that's, for me, incarnational and not guilt and shaming and all this other past where it causes people trauma, then more power. Again, this is just a framework to help us get rooted into who we are as a movement for wholeness in a fragmented world, and to keep us in mind of our mission as a whole church, to be and to share the good news and to serve from our doorsteps to the ends of the earth. All the while we're doing that, true community comes out of that. Passion for justice comes out of that. So all the vision of the Christian church comes out. So we are being more authentically ourselves. And that is the biggest thing out of this framework, is how are we being authentic to ourselves as a church, as a whole, whether we're new congregations or whether we're chartered congregations, how are we being authentically to who we are, or to who we say we are.
Yeah. Well, as we close, I wanted to just say a few things real quick. Stephen mentioned in the Q&A that we have to come up with new innovative models, or we will remain stuck.
Yeah,
and
amen.
Yes, absolutely. And some of the stuff that we're focusing on now is even behind some of the other things that are already happening. So we're trying to catch up, and we're trying to look ahead. We know that not all of these questions that you have answers or these questions that you want, we don't have answers to right now. We don't even have the answers to some of our own questions about this, but we believe that this is going to be life-changing and game-changing for our church and our tradition. We hope that you will stay engaged in this conversation, because this is not a one and done type of thing. We are going to expand upon this in the new year, and really dive deep into some of these core competencies of Disciples Next, faith-rooted organizing, prophetic advocacy, and contemplative action, so that you can have a better understanding of what those things mean. What does that look like? How does that apply to what you're doing? And so I would invite you to stay involved and stay engaged in what we're doing. I also want to mention that I am going to send out a recording to everyone who is here and those who registered but couldn't be here in real time. And I'll include some of the links and resources that were shared in the chat box. But for right now, I'm going to ask Reverend Dr. Jose to give us a quick farewell and benediction, and we will send you on your happy way.
All right. Well, thank you so much again, everybody, for showing up. And again, this conversation, it's not one-sided. People think I'm the expert. No, we are all in this together. We are all the experts. We have all a say into this whole thing. So please remember that. And with that, let's go into the word, a prayer and benediction. Gracious God, again, we thank you for this opportunity to be here, Lord, to have this community surrounding us as we move forward to do your will, Lord, as we create new communities of care that express your love. Be with us and guide us as we move forward from this time. We ask this in your Son's name, Jesus Christ. Amen. Go in peace.
Thanks, everyone.